My wife, Sarah, and I had always dreamed of vacationing in Los Angeles, but we wanted something special. After a lot of research, we found the perfect place, a luxurious mansion in the hills, with a view of the city and an infinity pool. The price was steep, but since we were celebrating our 5th wedding anniversary, we decided to treat ourselves. The house was a true dream, modern and elegant, with spacious rooms, floor-to-ceiling windows, and a sense of isolation that seemed perfect for a relaxing retreat. We arrived on a sunny afternoon, and everything seemed perfect. The host, named Mark, greeted us briefly, handed over the keys, and gave us a quick tour of the house. He seemed in a hurry, as if he had other commitments. After he left, we started exploring every detail, thrilled with the space. From the stunning pool to the luxurious kitchen. Everything was impeccable, but one thing struck us as odd. The closet in the master bedroom was surprisingly large, bigger than we had expected for a modern house. And in the far corner of the floor, hidden under a rug, we found something unusual, a small wooden door, discreet and almost imperceptible. Curious, we moved the rug and opened the door. There was a narrow staircase leading down to what seemed like a basement. Sarah hesitated, but my curiosity pushed me forward. Using my phone to light the way, I descended the steps while she followed. When we reached the bottom, we were met with something completely unexpected, an underground room with bare concrete walls. In the center of the space were surveillance cameras mounted, all pointed at various parts of the house. The most disturbing thing, however, were the chains attached to the walls, as if someone had been kept there. The room had a metallic, sterile smell, but the most terrifying thing was the absolute silence. We looked at each other in shock, unsure of what to do. My heart started to race, and the idea of being in a place that seemed like a secret prison filled me with dread. Sarah tugged my arm, and without a second thought, we quickly climbed the stairs, locking the door behind us. Panic set in, and we sat in the living room, trying to process what we had just seen. We decided to call Mark immediately and confront him about the room. He answered on the second ring, but when we mentioned what we had found, his response was cold. "You weren't supposed to mess with that. That room is none of your business," he said, in an almost threatening tone before abruptly hanging up. We sat in silence, shocked by his reaction. Something was clearly very wrong, and we both knew we couldn't stay there. We wasted no time. We packed our bags as fast as we could and left the house that same night. During the drive back to the hotel, we managed to book at the last minute. The feeling of danger lingered. Every second in that house had felt like a trap. We wondered what might have happened there before, and what that room was really for. The next day, we tried to report the incident to Airbnb, but without concrete proof beyond what we had seen, there wasn't much they could do. The house was temporarily removed from the site, but there were no guarantees that anything serious would be investigated. To this day, we don't know what was really going on in that house, but one thing is certain. That place was hiding something very dark. Since then, we haven't been able to rent any house without feeling a chill down our spines, remembering that secret room and the silent threat that loomed over us that night. My friends and I were excited to spend a weekend together away from the city. It had been a while since we last traveled as a group, and the idea of renting a country house on Airbnb seemed perfect. We found a charming property, isolated, surrounded by woods and mountains. The place promised to be the ideal retreat to rest, laugh, and enjoy good times. We arrived late on a Friday afternoon, exhausted from the trip, but excited for the coming days. The house was large, somewhat old, but very well preserved. It looked like one of those places you see in vacation movies. After settling in, we began preparing dinner and getting comfortable. Everything seemed normal until night fell. Around 10 p.m., while we were playing cards in the living room, one of my friends, Jake, went to the kitchen to grab more drinks. When he came back, he was pale and looked confused. There are people outside," he said, pointing to the windows. We went to the back door, which led to the house's outdoor area, and we all froze when we saw what he had noticed. There were at least 4 or 5 people standing at the edge of the yard, all dressed in long white robes. Even from a distance, we could see something painted on their foreheads. Strange symbols drawn in black ink glowed under the moonlight. We didn't know what to think. At first, we considered it might be some group of eccentric hikers, but this felt more serious, more disturbing. We tried to ignore it and go back inside, but it was impossible to shake the feeling that we were being watched. Minutes later, we heard footsteps outside, as if they were getting closer. The relaxed atmosphere we had felt earlier turned into palpable discomfort. One of my friends, Marcus, decided to be brave and go investigate. We grabbed flashlights and went outside together, trying to see what was happening. But when we crossed the yard, the people vanished into the darkness of the forest, as if they had never been there. We returned to the house, but the sense that something was wrong only grew. We began to wonder if that strange group had some connection to the property. Jake, always the most skeptical, decided to check the Airbnb description again. He read every detail, and that's when we noticed something we had overlooked. The host had mentioned that the house was used for monthly local events, which had seemed harmless at first. But now, with everything we were experiencing, that information took on a sinister tone. A growing fear gripped us all. We searched online for more about the area, trying to find out more about these events. That's when we found some old reports in local forums about mysterious cults that held gatherings on isolated properties. The description of the white robes and the symbols on their foreheads matched exactly what we had seen. The shock hit us like a punch. We had booked the house on the wrong weekend. The property wasn't supposed to be available to guests that weekend. It was the time when the cult gathered. We panicked. This wasn't a normal situation. We were alone in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by people who clearly didn't want us there. We decided we couldn't stay another minute. We packed our things as quickly as we could, throwing our bags into the car without looking back. Every little noise outside seemed to come from one of the figures we had seen earlier, and the feeling that we were being followed paralyzed us. As soon as we got into the car and sped down the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror and swear I saw some white-robed figures in the distance, standing in the darkness, watching as we fled. No one spoke the entire drive back to the city. The silence in the car was almost as terrifying as the experience we had just lived through. The next day, we tried contacting the host to report what had happened, but he only responded with a short, cold message. "You shouldn't have been there that weekend." That only confirmed what we feared. Since then, we've never been able to rent an Airbnb in such a remote place. We don't know for sure what they were doing in that house, but one thing is certain: we weren't welcome, and whatever was happening was something we weren't supposed to witness. Sarah and I had always been lucky with our Airbnb choices. So when we found a charming house on the outskirts of Asheville, North Carolina, we thought it would be another peaceful trip. The house was perfect, cozy, with rustic decor and a stunning view of the mountains. It was in an isolated area, surrounded by dense forests and untouched trails. Ideal for us, as we were looking for peace and quiet. We arrived on Thursday, and the first few days were wonderful. Hiking, outdoor dinners, quiet nights by the fireplace. The house felt like a dream. It was spacious but also warm and inviting, with no signs of trouble. Until the last night. That Saturday, we had already made our plans to return to the city the next day. The night started off normally, with us watching a movie before going to bed around midnight. The silence around the house was almost absolute, except for the soft wind blowing through the trees. However, shortly after we lay down, I started hearing strange noises coming from the walls. At first, they were light tapping sounds, like something scratching the wood from within. I thought it might be an animal, perhaps a mouse in the attic, so I didn't pay much attention. But the sounds persisted. Soft tapping, and then suddenly whispers. I thought I was imagining things, but when I looked at Sarah, I saw that she was also alert, her eyes wide open, staring at the wall near the bed. "Did you hear that?" I asked, trying to stay calm, but my heart was racing. She nodded, clearly frightened. The sound of whispers seemed to come from all around us, as if we were being surrounded. I checked the doors and windows. Everything was locked. There were no signs of anyone entering. We tried to calm down and go back to sleep, but the feeling that we weren't alone in that house was unbearable. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up to louder banging and the bed empty beside me. Sarah was gone. My heart raced as I called her name repeatedly, with no response. I ran down the hallway, searching every corner of the house, but there was no sign of her anywhere. That's when I decided to call the police. When the officers arrived, they inspected every room, every closet, every nook. There were no signs of forced entry, and the doors and windows were still locked from the inside. It was as if Sarah had simply disappeared without a trace. But what they found in the walls was even more disturbing. Scratches, deep marks as if someone, or something, had been trying to escape from inside the walls. Those marks hadn't been there before. I was sure of it. And the tapping? The whispers? They had come from inside the house, not outside. The police questioned whether Sarah could have gotten lost in the surrounding area, but I knew that didn't make sense. The house had been completely locked, and those strange sounds, they still echoed in my head. After a thorough search and countless questions, the police seemed as puzzled as I was. There were no clues as to where Sarah could have gone, and the idea that someone had been living hidden inside the house, perhaps within the walls themselves, was met with skepticism. But those scratches were real, and nothing could explain what had happened there. I knew with a crushing certainty that the house was hiding something far darker than it appeared. The search continued the next morning, but Sarah was never found. I returned to the city, devastated and without answers. A few days later, the Airbnb owner called me. He didn't seem surprised to hear what had happened, which only made me more suspicious. "I'm sorry for what happened," he said without much emotion. "Some people say the house has a presence, something we can't explain." I hung up immediately, filled with a mix of anger and despair. That house, that night, something was deeply wrong. To this day, no one knows what really happened to Sarah. But those whispers, the banging, and the scratch marks still haunt me. And sometimes I wonder, is she still there, trapped somehow deep within that house, waiting to be found?
If you're enjoying the story so far, don't forget to smash that like button and subscribe to the channel for more creepy stories just like these. And hey, have you ever had a paranormal experience? Drop a comment below and share your story with us. We'd love to hear it. Now, let's dive into the next story.
After my wife passed away, everything around me felt suffocating. The routine with the kids, work, and the void left by her absence were consuming me. I knew I needed a break, a moment away from everything to breathe and try to put the family back together. That's why I decided to rent a house on Airbnb for a few days. I chose a quiet property on the outskirts of Savannah, Georgia, with a spacious garden and a pool. The idea was simple: relax and give the kids a different environment, far from the sadness of our home. We arrived in the late afternoon. The house was exactly like the pictures, even more beautiful in person, with large trees surrounding it and an almost complete silence. It was the perfect refuge, or at least it seemed to be. The kids quickly ran off to explore, and I tried to settle in. We needed this, and for a brief moment, I thought I had made the right choice. On the first night, while the kids were sleeping, I went to the kitchen for a glass of water. I looked out the window and saw a figure moving near the pool. I frowned, trying to focus better in the dark. It looked like an elderly woman, dressed in a faded nightgown, slowly walking around the yard. I thought it might be a confused neighbor, so I went outside to see if she needed help. As I got closer, the woman turned to me. Her eyes were clouded, and the skin on her face had a pale, almost translucent tone. "You're the pool caretaker, aren't you?" she asked, her voice low and hoarse. I was speechless for a second. "Sorry, ma'am, I'm just renting the house for a few days." "Are you lost?" I asked, trying to stay calm. She stared at me deeply, as if she were trying to decipher who I was. "The pool needs to be cleaned," was all she said before turning and slowly walking into the darkness of the garden. Confused and a little shaken, I went back inside and locked the door. I spent the rest of the night awake, thinking about the strange woman. Who was she? And why was she wandering around the property? The night passed slowly, with every sound in the house making me more and more uneasy. When the sun finally rose, it was clear to me that something was wrong. The next day, I tried to forget what had happened and didn't mention anything to the kids. We spent the day exploring the town, but the image of the woman wouldn't leave my mind. When we returned to the house in the afternoon, I decided to do some research on the property. That's when I found an old article, buried in a local forum, that mentioned a murder that had occurred there years ago. An elderly woman, around 80 years old, had been found dead in the garden near the pool. According to the article, she had lived alone and had been attacked by an intruder. The case was never solved. A chill ran down my spine. The description of the woman matched exactly the figure I had seen the night before. And what terrified me even more was the final detail. She used to ask the pool caretaker to come every week, but he didn't show up on the day of her death. That night, while the kids slept, I couldn't relax. The weight of the atmosphere in the house felt different, oppressive. I sat in the living room, listening to every little noise. Around midnight, I heard the footsteps again outside, near the pool. My breath quickened. I didn't want to, but something forced me to look. I stood up slowly and went to the window. There she was again, standing by the pool, motionless, watching me. Her gaze was empty, yet somehow intense. I closed the curtains, trying to control the panic rising inside me. I knew that woman wasn't real, at least not anymore. She was trapped in that house, repeating the same cycle, night after night. I decided we couldn't stay there another day. The next morning, I woke the kids and made up an excuse to leave early. As we left the house, I glanced one last time at the garden. Nothing, just the silence and the sun shining over the pool, as if everything I had seen was part of a nightmare. Later, when I returned the keys and explained to the host that we were leaving early, he gave me a sad smile. "Not everyone can stay here for long," he said enigmatically. When I asked directly about the woman, he just shook his head and walked away, as if it was something he had heard many times before. To this day, I avoid thinking too much about that house. But one thing I know, whatever happened to that woman, her spirit still wandered there, waiting for something. Or someone. My wife, Lily, and I were in desperate need of a break from our hectic routine, so we decided to rent an Airbnb in a remote area of Wyoming. It was a charming country house, isolated, surrounded by snow-covered mountains and pine trees. It was the perfect place to relax and disconnect, and the 4 days we had planned there seemed like exactly what we needed. We brought our 2 dogs, Max and Ruby, to enjoy the open space. Everything was set for the perfect getaway. We arrived in the late afternoon, and the house was just as promised, cozy and welcoming. The host had mentioned that the property had been vacant for 6 months, so it would need a quick check, which we did as soon as we arrived. Everything seemed fine, but what caught our attention immediately were the footprints in the fresh snow around the house. We hadn't seen anyone for miles when we arrived, and the footprints were recent, leading into the forest surrounding the property. That made us uncomfortable, but we tried not to think too much about it. It was an isolated place. Maybe someone had passed through before we arrived. On the first night, we settled in and relaxed in the living room while our dogs rested near the fireplace. Max and Ruby, usually calm, began acting strangely. Both were restless, sniffing the air with their ears perked up, as if they sensed something we couldn't. Max, the more protective of the two, went to the door and started growling softly. I opened the door, shining a flashlight into the yard, but I didn't see anything. The night was quiet, and the freshly fallen snow reflected the moonlight, making everything visible. However, the feeling of being watched didn't go away. The next morning, as we were having breakfast, I noticed something that made my heart race. More footprints. They now circled the house in an almost methodical way, as if someone had been walking around the property, watching inside. I called Lily over, and she was just as uneasy as I was. We decided to follow the footprints into the forest, but they disappeared abruptly among the trees, with no sign of who could have made them. My mind raced, imagining if someone could be hiding, perhaps using the isolation of the house as cover. The thought put me on high alert. That night, the dogs were even more agitated. Max growled softly whenever he approached the door, and Ruby seemed unable to calm down. We started to wonder if there was indeed something or someone around the house. We decided to secure the house more thoroughly. Every window was locked, and we placed chairs against the doors. I tried to sleep, but every little sound made me get up and check the windows, hoping not to see anyone outside. What had started as a relaxing retreat was turning into a terrifying experience. On the third night, the turning point came. We were in the living room, trying to watch a movie, when Max suddenly began barking desperately at the back door. When I went to check, I heard quick footsteps in the snow, and this time I was sure someone was nearby. I grabbed my flashlight and ran outside, illuminating the yard, but saw no one. The footprints, however, were unmistakable, starting from the side of the house and disappearing again into the forest. We called the host, who seemed incredulous. He mentioned that in the 6 months the house had been vacant, there had been no reports of suspicious activity. But something wasn't right, and our instincts told us we needed to be careful. I tried to convince him to send someone to check the property, but he lived far away, and by then it was too late for an immediate visit. On the last night, we decided not to take any more chances. We stayed awake, monitoring any movement around the house. Max and Ruby continued to alert us, but this time we didn't hear footsteps. However, the tension was present the entire time, and every minute seemed to drag on. When the sun finally began to rise, we quickly packed our things and left earlier than planned. We still don't know who or what was circling that house. Maybe it was someone using the vacant property as a hideout or just someone passing through, but the constant feeling of being watched and the presence of the footprints left us unsettled the entire time. That trip was supposed to be a relaxing break, but it turned into something we will never forget. Since then, we've always thought twice before choosing such an isolated place to stay. At the end of October, my wife, Emily, and I decided to take a short trip to disconnect from our daily routine and enjoy a few peaceful days in rural Colorado. We found a cabin on Airbnb that seemed perfect, isolated, surrounded by forests, and with an incredible view of the mountains. The owner had mentioned that the place was ideal for anyone seeking peace and tranquility, which was exactly what attracted us. We arrived around 4 in the afternoon, and everything seemed normal, even charming. The house was simple but cozy, with a porch facing a dense forest. As soon as we arrived, we unloaded our bags and explored the grounds a bit. There was an almost complete silence, interrupted only by the rustling of leaves and the distant sound of a stream. It felt like the perfect retreat, or so we thought. We spent the afternoon walking around the house, preparing a light dinner and chatting. But as the sun began to set, the atmosphere around the house changed. The forest, which had seemed calm, now felt as though it was watching us, enveloped in growing shadows. Around 10 at night, already inside the house, we heard a sound outside, something like heavy footsteps on the wooden porch. At first, I thought it might be an animal, but when Emily looked out the window, her face turned pale. "There's someone outside," she whispered, pointing into the darkness. I ran to the window, but saw no one. The sound of the footsteps had stopped. We tried to calm ourselves, believing it could be a deer or some other animal. We decided to lock all the doors and windows, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. A little while later, we heard it again, footsteps, but this time they seemed to come from behind the house. Our fear grew. Who could be lurking around in such an isolated place? I grabbed my phone and tried to call the Airbnb owner, but the call wouldn't go through. The cell reception was terrible. We were alone, in the middle of nowhere, and the presence outside seemed more real with each passing minute. Around midnight, we heard the sound of a car. At first, we felt relieved, thinking maybe it was the owner coming to check on us. But when we looked out the window, what we saw chilled us to the bone. A car was parked in front of the house, its lights off, and it didn't look like the same one we had seen in the owner's photos. We couldn't see who was inside, but it was clear someone was watching us from that vehicle. We were completely frozen. Panic took over. We decided we wouldn't stay the night there. We grabbed our things as quickly as we could and jumped into our car. But the worst was yet to come. When I started the engine and prepared to drive off, the unknown car began to follow us, still with its lights off. I tried to stay calm, driving along the dirt road that would lead us back to the main highway. The car stayed right behind us, keeping a disturbingly close distance. At that point, we could barely think straight. We were being chased without knowing why or who was behind us. Finally, when we reached the main road, the mysterious car made a sharp turn and disappeared into the forest. We drove through the night without stopping, our hearts still racing, until we found a gas station in a small town. We spent the rest of the night there, inside the car, unable to return to that house. In the morning, we called the Airbnb owner and reported what had happened. He sounded confused and surprised, swearing that no one else should have been in the area. I still don't know what happened that night, who was stalking us, or why that car followed us. But the feeling of being watched, surrounded by something or someone unknown, still haunts me. I needed a break. After months of exhausting work, I decided to take a few days for myself and found an Airbnb in a small town in rural Texas. The house was perfect, cozy, isolated, and surrounded by vast fields. There wasn't much around, just silence, exactly what I needed. I arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, and so far, everything seemed perfect. I spent the day exploring the town, and that night, I returned to the house, eager for a good night's rest. That first night went smoothly. The house had an old feel to it, but was comfortable. I made some tea, sat on the couch, and let myself be lulled by the tranquility of the place. But on the second night, things changed. It was past 11 p.m. when I heard loud knocks on the front door. The sound was so unexpected that I almost dropped the tea I was holding. My first reaction was confusion. Who would be knocking at the door at this hour in such a remote place? I thought it might be a mistake, maybe a neighbor in need of help or a lost delivery driver. But the unease quickly set in. I cautiously approached the door without opening it. "Who is it?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, though my heart was racing. "Sorry, but I think there's been a mistake. We booked this house, and now it's locked. Could you let us in?" The voice on the other side sounded too controlled, almost as if rehearsed. A chill ran down my spine. Instinctively, I made up a lie. "My husband's asleep, but he can come down to resolve this." I was alone, but something told me it was better not to reveal that. "Oh, no need to bother him. We can resolve this quickly. Just open the door," the voice insisted. Something was very wrong. I felt an urgent need to check who was outside. I went to a side window and cautiously peeked through the curtain. What I saw nearly stopped my heart. It wasn't just one person, as the man at the door had made it seem. There were 3 people, all masked, crouched near the entrance, trying to hide. They didn't look like curious or lost individuals. They were prepared. My mind went into a panic, but I had to think fast. I ran to the bedroom, grabbed my phone, and with trembling hands, dialed the police. My voice was low and shaky as I explained the situation. "I'm at an Airbnb. There are people trying to get in. They're masked. Please come quickly." The emergency operator remained calm, telling me a patrol car was already on its way. But I knew every minute felt like an eternity. While I waited, I heard the sound I dreaded most, the noise of the lock being forced. They were trying to break in, terror took over, and my only reaction was to run to the bathroom at the back of the house. I locked the door and sat on the floor, trying to control my breathing. I heard the front door crash open, followed by heavy footsteps. They were inside. The sound of footsteps echoed through the house, accompanied by low voices, almost whispers. They were searching, looking for something or someone. I crouched in the corner of the bathroom, feeling the cold floor against my legs, trying not to make any noise that would give me away. Every second felt like an hour, my heart pounding so hard I feared they could hear it from outside. I heard drawers being opened, objects falling to the floor, and a wave of terror washed over me at the thought that they might find me. But then, suddenly, the sound I had been waiting for, sirens in the distance, growing louder by the second. They heard it too. The commotion in the house stopped for a moment, followed by the sound of hurried footsteps. They were fleeing. I heard the front door slam, followed by the screeching of tires as they sped away. I stayed locked in the bathroom until the sound of the sirens grew close, and I heard voices outside, this time the police. When I finally emerged, trembling and disoriented, they were already inside, inspecting the house. The intruders had fled, but not before rifling through my things and taking a few belongings, including my laptop and some cash. The police were efficient and understanding, but the shock of what had happened left me shaken. The officer who stayed with me during the investigation was clear. They probably had this planned and knew the house was vacant for long periods. Your quick action in calling the police likely prevented something worse. I left that house the next day without looking back. To this day, the thought of those masked people, who could have done much more, still haunts me. And since then, I've never been able to sleep peacefully in an Airbnb again. A few months ago, I needed a place to stay for a week while attending an intensive course in a nearby city. My friend Ben offered me his vacation home, which he usually rented out on Airbnb. It was a simple house near a quiet lake in Michigan, and it seemed perfect for what I needed: peace and privacy. I arrived late on a Tuesday afternoon, and Ben came to meet me, showing me around the house and handing over the key. The place was cozy and well-maintained, with a slightly vintage feel, as if nothing had been updated since the 90s. The first night was uneventful. After a long trip, all I wanted to do was relax, and the place seemed perfect for that. The next day, after returning from the course, I decided to take a shower to prepare for a night of studying. As I entered the bathroom, something caught my eye. Attached to the wall, near the mirror, was a power adapter that seemed a bit out of place. It was one of those adapters with multiple USB ports, but something about it didn't seem right. It was at a strange angle, as if it had been poorly positioned. For a moment, I thought it was just paranoia, but something in my mind told me to investigate further. I approached the adapter and noticed there was a small lens hidden behind one of the USB ports. My stomach dropped. I didn't know what to do. My first reaction was to think that maybe it was just a coincidence or some kind of security device. But part of me couldn't shake the idea that it could be something much more sinister. I unscrewed the adapter from the wall with the help of a screwdriver I found in the kitchen cabinet. And to my surprise, there was a small memory card inside. Fear mixed with curiosity. I had to know what was on it. I ran to my laptop, inserted the memory card, and opened it. There were several videos, and as I opened them, my heart began to race. Some were recent recordings, including footage of me in the bathroom the night before. Other videos showed people I didn't know, likely previous guests of the house. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. My mind was a mess of fear and disgust. I immediately turned off the computer and tried to think of what to do next. I called Ben and asked him to come to the house as soon as possible. When he arrived, I explained what I had found. He was shocked, vehemently denying any involvement. The house was managed by his family, but he had no idea where that device could have come from. We decided to tell his parents everything. When they arrived, Ben's father seemed particularly uncomfortable. He stayed quiet for a while before finally admitting that he had brought that adapter to the house. He explained that a co-worker, with whom he shared some tools and gadgets, had given him the adapter, saying it was great for charging multiple devices. He had no idea there was a hidden camera. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Ben's mother suggested we take the device to the police immediately. I was relieved not to have to handle it alone, but the nervousness about how the situation could escalate grew with every minute. At the police station, we handed over the adapter and memory card. The officers took it seriously and began investigating. Things got even more complicated when they discovered that Ben's father's co-worker was already a suspect in an investigation related to illegal recordings at another location. The police were now trying to determine if he had been using similar devices to film people without their knowledge in other places. What was supposed to be a peaceful and productive week turned into one of the most disturbing experiences of my life. I'll never look at a power adapter the same way again. To this day, I wonder how many people were recorded without knowing, and whether that coworker will ever be truly punished for what he did. One thing I know, from now on, I'll always check every detail when entering a strange place, whether it's a vacation home or even a simple bathroom. I used to rent out my house on Airbnb. For a few years, it was a great way to earn extra income and keep the property in use. The house was located in a quiet neighborhood in Nashville, and it always attracted young couples or small groups of friends looking for a short stay. But over time, Managing both the Airbnb and my day job became burdensome. Dealing with bookings, cleaning the place, and handling small issues from a distance became stressful. I decided it was time to stop. However, it was the last incident that made me quit for good. One afternoon, I received a message from a guest who had booked the house for the weekend. It was a young couple based on their profile picture and description, so I thought it would be another quiet stay. However, they messaged me saying the water wasn't working. I was in the middle of a meeting when I received the notice, and it irritated me a little because the house's maintenance was always up to date. But not wanting to leave the guests in a bind, I told them to wait, and I'd resolve the issue personally. I drove to the house, thinking it would be a quick fix. But when I arrived and knocked on the door, it wasn't a young couple who answered. A burly man with an unfriendly expression stared at me for a moment before asking dryly, "Are you the owner?" Surprised, I confirmed and asked about the couple who had made the reservation. He just shrugged and, without responding, stepped aside, letting me in. When I entered the house, the atmosphere was strange, with furniture slightly out of place, and the tension in the air was palpable. As I walked through the living room, I noticed two more men inside. Clearly, this was not what I had expected. The third man stood in the corner, with a gun visibly strapped to his waist. That was the moment my survival instincts kicked in. There was no way I could confront three men, especially with a gun involved. I kept calm, trying not to show the fear growing inside me, and pretended I was going to check the water issue. "I'll take a look at the pipes outside," I said, walking out the door with my heart racing. As soon as I passed through the gate, I ran to the car and called the police. I quickly explained what was happening and asked them to come as fast as possible. My mind was racing. I knew something was wrong, but I had no idea how bad it could get. I waited on a nearby street, watching from a distance as police lights illuminated the house a few minutes later. The officers arrived and removed the three men from the house. They discovered that the credit card used to book the house was stolen, and the supposed couple who had made the reservation never existed. To make matters worse, when inspecting the house, I noticed that several valuable items had been stolen. An antique watch I had inherited from my grandfather, some of my mother's jewelry, and even a small safe with personal documents. The feeling of violation and betrayal was overwhelming. After the police took the men away, I was in shock. I couldn't believe what had just happened in my own home, a place I had maintained with such care. I knew Airbnb had its risks, but I never imagined something like this could happen to me. That night made it clear that I couldn't continue with this. The idea of strangers coming in and out of my house, potentially being anyone, was more than I could handle. I decided to close my Airbnb account right after that. From that moment on, I opted to rent the house traditionally to long-term tenants. It was no longer worth risking my safety and peace of mind for a few bookings. It was a bitter but necessary lesson. Now, the house is occupied by a young couple who renewed their lease for another year, and I can finally sleep peacefully knowing I don't have to deal with any more frightening surprises. I've always been cautious with my Airbnb bookings, choosing highly rated places in quiet neighborhoods. For my trip to Portland, I did the same. I found a small, well-located studio near shops and cafes with solid reviews. The host, named Greg, seemed friendly and helpful in our messages, so everything felt smooth. I was ready to spend 4 days relaxing and exploring the city. I arrived in the late afternoon, and the studio was exactly as pictured. Simple but cozy. It was the perfect spot for someone who just needed a base to explore Portland. Check-in went without a hitch, and I soon settled in. I spent the first day out walking around the neighborhoods and soaking in the atmosphere. The location was ideal, and when I returned that evening, tired, I was satisfied with my choice. On the second day, I left to explore more, leaving most of my belongings in the studio, including my wallet with some cash. When I returned later, something felt off. I couldn't quite explain it, but the studio didn't seem exactly as I had left it. Some of my things appeared slightly out of place, but I tried not to dwell on it. Maybe I was just tired and imagining things. It wasn't until I needed money for dinner that night that I realized the problem. I opened my wallet and immediately knew something was wrong. Before leaving that morning, I had counted my cash, $300 in $20 bills. Now there was less than half of that. My heart sank. I rummaged through my bags and checked every possible place, but the truth was clear. Someone had gone through my things and taken the money. Immediately, my mind raced through all the possibilities. The door had been locked when I returned. There were no signs of forced entry. The only logical explanation was that someone with a key had entered while I was away. The only one with access would have been Greg, the host, or someone he trusted. Feeling frustrated, I sent him a message, trying to be polite but direct. I explained the situation and asked if anyone, for any reason, could have accessed the studio. His response came quickly, but it wasn't what I expected. "I'm sorry for what happened, but no one else has access to the property. I'm sure it was just a misunderstanding. Maybe you misplaced the money somewhere." The casual way he dismissed the possibility of theft infuriated me. I knew I hadn't lost the money. I knew exactly where it had been, and now, part of it was simply gone. I decided to check the place again. Frustration gave way to a growing sense of unease. I realized it wasn't just my belongings that had been touched. Even the kitchen drawers were slightly open, as if someone had rifled through the place quickly. That only solidified my conviction that something was very wrong. The next morning, I tried calling Greg, this time directly. He answered, but the conversation was even colder. "I already told you, no one entered the house," he repeated, almost irritated. "This is a safe area, and nothing like this has ever happened before. Maybe you should think twice before accusing people." The defensive way he responded made me even more suspicious. It seemed like he was evading responsibility, not even considering the possibility that someone with a key could have entered. With the end of my stay approaching, I decided it was best not to prolong the situation. It was clear Greg wasn't going to cooperate, and honestly, the thought of staying there, knowing someone could come in at any moment, made me uncomfortable. On the last day, I left the studio earlier than planned, still bitter about what had happened. When I returned home, I contacted Airbnb and reported what had happened. But without concrete proof, there wasn't much they could do besides apologize and open an investigation. With no signs of forced entry or clear evidence, it was my word against Greg's. In the end, I was left without the money and with a lingering feeling of violation. Today, whenever I book an Airbnb, I'm even more cautious. I bring extra locks for my bags and avoid leaving valuables in the places I stay. That experience taught me a harsh lesson about trust, and the feeling of someone having gone through my things without my knowledge still haunts me. If you enjoyed these true horror stories, you won't want to miss our next video. Check out 10 true scary Facebook horror stories by clicking the card on the screen or finding it as the previous video on our channel. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and let us know in the comments if you've ever had a paranormal experience. We'd love to hear your stories. Stay brave, and we'll see you in the next video.